From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden escalates a dispute with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over judicial reform in Israel. Why is the U.S. president meddling in the internal politics of an ally? Also, President Tsai Ing-wen of the Republic of China, more commonly known as Taiwan, is visiting the United States this week and next, and the People's Republic of China is threatening a response if she meets with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Republicans, meanwhile, say the White House should be doing more to help Taiwan. The politics of foreign policy today on Potomac Watch. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. I'm here with two of my distinguished colleagues, Kim Strassel and Elliot Kaufman. Welcome to you both. Let's start with Israel. Background: judicial reform is a major controversy in Israel, maybe the biggest domestic controversy in a very long time. We don't want to get too much into the weeds on it, but a quick summary: Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition won the recent election in part running on judicial reform. The details that have emerged since in a proposal have caused a huge uproar in Israel, a lot of opposition, protests in the streets, threat of a national strike, even some opposition among reservists in the military, which is particularly concerning to a country which has so many enemies on its borders. The U.S. State Department criticized the proposal, which is unusual enough. And on Monday, the Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, delayed consideration of the proposal, told that in an announcement to the country, delayed consideration of it in the legislature, and said he wanted to find a national consensus. All right, fair enough. That's the sort of thing that happens in democracy. Then on Tuesday, President Biden nonetheless took a shot at the Prime Minister. Let's listen.
Like many strong supporters of Israel, I'm very concerned. And I'm concerned that they get this straight. They cannot continue down this road. And I've sort of made that clear. Hopefully the Prime Minister will act in a way that he's going to try to work out some genuine compromise, but that remains to be seen.
Prime Minister Netanyahu to the White House, sir? You think
No.
he'll be coming to Washington?
Not in the near term.
Elliot, you followed this whole debate inside Israel for weeks, and I was really surprised to hear the president come out like this. He'd been calling for compromise. Netanyahu says, I'm going to compromise. And then he says he better drop it and takes a shot at him. What's going on here? What do you think the motivation for President Biden is?
Well, I think he's listening to a lot of people who are concerned that the reform is the end of democracy in Israel, which I think is very much overwrought. I mean, there have been for quite a long time serious problems with Israel's Supreme Court, which over decades has loosed itself from all the usual restraints on a Supreme Court's power. Some of the reforms may go too far, some, not, but this is a sort of normal part of a reform process in a democracy. I think a U.S. president has a lot of goodwill in Israel. Israel is a pro-American country. There are a lot of countries out there, even U.S. allies, where anti-Americanism is endemic, reflexive. Israel isn't one of those countries. So a U.S. president can speak, can offer advice, and has room to influence. But President Biden seems to have misplayed his hand here. And I think he did it in two ways. First, in his off-the-cuff comments, he seemed unaware that Netanyahu has already compromised, has already watered down, moderated the proposals, paused them for serious negotiations, consultations. And when you're sort of sticking your nose in another country's business, it's never a good look for it to be that you don't know what you're talking about. You're not really informed.
You don't know the state of play.
Exactly. So that was the first issue there. The second is, it's common to give advice, to kind of express a position, but to say, as President Biden did, that Israel cannot do something on a purely domestic Israeli issue can't help but rub voters there the wrong way. If President Biden should want to reform the U.S. Senate or get rid of the Electoral College or even pack America's Supreme Court, those might all be very bad ideas, But Americans would not like it one bit if some foreign country said that Americans cannot do that. Americans can decide how they want to be governed, and presumably Israelis can do the same. So it's one thing for President Biden to intervene and try to influence the situation. It's another to tell Israelis what they can and cannot do on a domestic issue.
The influence of an American president is considerable in Israel for the reasons you stated, and because we've been fast friends, and the Israelis understand that they rely on the support, defense, and so on, diplomatic, of the United States in a very rough neighborhood. So what he says matters in Israel. And from time to time, you've had administrations in the past that have attempted to influence the politics in Israel. I can think of Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush, who tried to influence an election and did, I think. But the goal there was to influence Israeli politics toward the Palestinians, essentially a deal that was in part about foreign policy. This is a strictly domestic issue. It's as if Bibi Netanyahu had given remarks to reporters saying, boy, that student loan write-off by President Biden, I think that's way unconstitutional, and it's a threat to democracy. And, I don't know what he's doing there, but I hope he reaches some kind of compromise. We would have all said, give me a break, Bibi. Leave us alone. This is the kind of intervention, Kim, that is so striking because it is such a purely domestic issue. And it makes me wonder if Biden is just really hostile to Netanyahu personally and wouldn't mind if his coalition actually fell and they had to have another election.
Oh, I think he is hostile to Netanyahu. They play nice most of the time, but according to some reporting, this president still feels very aggrieved, going all the way back to his time when he was vice president, in particular that Netanyahu, you may remember, came to the United States in 2015 and gave an address in front of Congress criticizing the Obama-Iranian nuclear deal. Now, I could argue that that was a legitimate thing for him to do in that he was talking about Israeli national security and their concerns about what would happen. And he warned that if this deal went through, it almost made certain that Iran would get its nuclear weapons. But that apparently rubbed a lot of people in the Obama administration the wrong way. I think that there's also some evidence that in the last election, while Netanyahu obviously didn't endorse a candidate, he made clear that Biden wasn't his favored candidate. So I think that that is a personal level, some issues. And as we all know, Biden tends to react to things on a personal level, which is not always a great place for a president to be. I think what also is playing in here too, Paul, is that he is getting a lot of pressure from progressives in his party. Only recently, 92 House Democrats sent him a letter complaining about the judicial reform, complaining about another act that the Netanyahu government took recently, allowing for some more settlements to begin happening again, demanding that there be more pressure for a two-state solution, asking that the White House actually punish Israel for some of these steps. And as we know, this president does tend to listen to its progressive wing and bow to many of its demands. So this may be an attempt to signal to those in his party that he's doing something. I think the risk here, though, is, as you say, American politicians, American presidents, when they speak, they have a real voice in Israel. And some of the problem here is that sometimes you can get a boomerang and the opposite of what you're hoping, because you could end up in a situation where precisely because the president is exerting this pressure, you might have Netanyahu forces who don't want to look as though they are bowing to that and giving in to Washington, and could cause people to dig in even further.
The settlements you referred to, Kim, being the Jewish settlements on the West Bank, which is where so much of the controversy is about the Palestinian and Israeli government issue. But your point about Biden listening to the American progressive movement, which has become, Elliot, and I know you follow this closely, has become more anti-Israel, much more during my lifetime than it was when I was a young man. And the president made a reference in his remarks to what he called the American Jewish view of judicial reform in Israel. I don't sense that there's one American Jewish view, and you would, of course, know that better than me. There's a debate here, just like there, over whether this reform is good at all, how far it should go, how it should be compromised. And we've had a robust debate on our pages about it.
That's right. I mean, I think he may have confused that with the New York Times view, most likely. But part of the problem is just that it's, in some ways, an abstruse issue. The idea that, for instance, one doesn't need standing to bring a case before the Israeli Supreme Court, or that
And standing as defined by a concrete injury.
Right. You don't need it there. You do here. Justiciability, there are no restrictions on that, meaning you can challenge any kind of political question, foreign policy question, even military question. There's no understanding that there is a political sphere that maybe judges should stay out of and leave up to democratic choice of citizens and their representatives.
Supreme Court can overrule a legislative decision and even overrule cabinet choices, correct?
That's right. Say a certain cabinet choice is unreasonable, and in fact, the only reasonable choice is this one candidate. It's done that in the past. But if you're not following an issue very closely, that's the kind of thing in another country's domestic politics where you just wouldn't know. And all you might see is you read in the Western press that, oh, another country is sort of going after its court, not knowing that its court has all of these highly unusual procedures. So I think a lot of what's behind it is people not knowing the facts, like we saw with President Biden. And it's noteworthy that the White House, since President Biden's comments, has sort of tried to smooth things over. Not for the first time, some White House staff may have realized that President Biden said some things off the cuff where he wasn't really aware of exactly how the situation was going. They probably didn't want these comments now after they'd already gotten what they wanted from Netanyahu. Pause the reforms, work with the opposition, and work toward some type of compromise solution.
The gracious Elliot Kaufman giving President Biden the benefit of the doubt there that he screwed up as opposed to that it was deliberate.